All right, so you know how it is with all these news stories about smartphone security risks. It's like trying to drink from a fire hose.
Right. It can be overwhelming.
It really can. So we've got a bunch of shared sources here, and our goal for this deep dive is, well, basically we're going to boil it all down to the essentials.
Hmm.
You know what you really need to know to protect yourself without getting bogged down in all the technical details. I mean, let's face it, smartphones are basically part of us these days.
Yeah. An extension of ourselves.
Exactly, and they hold so much sensitive information, and that unfortunately makes them a prime target,
A
right?
huge target. Absolutely. And what's particularly interesting is that these attacks are constantly evolving.
Yeah.
We're not just dealing with, simple viruses anymore. It's a constant game of cat and mouse
Yeah.
with increasingly sophisticated methods.
So let's get right to it. What are the main threats out there?
Well, I think it's helpful to think of it like this. Think of your phone and all the different ways that someone could try to break in. Each of those ways represents a different vulnerability.
Okay, that makes sense. So kind of like different doors that attackers are trying to open.
Exactly. And if we understand what those doors are, we can start to build up our defenses.
So what's the first door?
Well, the first one is malware. And under that umbrella, you've got things like spyware. This is stuff that's designed to secretly monitor what you're doing.
So like keystrokes.
Yeah, keystrokes, websites you visit, your location. Some spyware can even access your camera and microphone without you knowing.
That's scary. I mean, are there any real-world examples of this?
Oh, tons. You've got Ratmalad, which was disguised as a virtual number app. And there's this one called Cherryblos that's actually using OCR, which is optical character recognition, to steal cryptocurrency recovery phrases.
Wow, they're getting really advanced.
They are. What makes spyware particularly dangerous is that it often operates without any obvious signs. So you might not even know that it's there.
So we really have to be careful about what we download.
Yeah, and the permissions we grant to apps.
Right. So that's spyware. What's the next kind of malware?
Well, then you have ransomware. This is where they essentially lock your data or your entire phone and demand money to unlock it. It's like a digital shakedown.
Hostage situation for your phone.
Yeah. You've got things like Mallocker B, which displays a persistent ransom note on your phone, and Leaker Locker, which actually threatens to expose your data if you don't pay.
So it's not just about locking you out anymore. They're actually threatening to leak your information.
Right. And that adds a whole other layer of pressure. Do you remember that attack on iPhones a few years back where they locked people's devices through phishing?
Yeah. I think that was back in 2014.
Yeah, we're seeing more and more of that. It's a trend.
That's really unsettling. Okay, so ransomware is a big one. What else is there?
Well, there are also banking Trojans. These specifically target your financial information in banking apps and payment apps
So they're after your money.
directly. They use things like overlay attacks. So imagine you're trying to log into your bank app and a fake login screen pops up over the real one.
And you wouldn't even know.
Exactly. They can look incredibly convincing. And then there's keylogging, where they record everything you type. And they can even intercept SMS messages with your banking codes.
It seems like they're always one step ahead.
Yeah, they're constantly adapting. We've seen examples like Xenomorph, which specifically targets banking apps, and Medusa, which uses SMS phishing to steal credentials.
It's getting harder and harder to tell what's real and what's fake.
That's why it's crucial to be extra vigilant when you're entering any financial details. Double-check the app itself, not just the login screen.
Okay, that's really good advice. So we've covered spyware, ransomware, banking Trojans. What about adware?
Ah, yes, adware. It's more than just annoying.
Yeah, it's those annoying ads that pop up everywhere. But what else does it do?
Well, besides flooding you with unwanted ads, it can actually slow down your phone. It can even install more dangerous malware in some cases.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yep. And it can try to gain deeper access to your system. And what's concerning is that we've even seen adware sneak its way onto the official Google Play Store.
So even downloading from a trusted source is not a guarantee.
Right. It highlights the need to be aware of the permissions you're granting to apps, even if you're downloading from a reputable source.
Okay, so we've covered the major types of malware. Are there any other kinds we should be aware of?
Oh, there are plenty. There are viruses, which attach themselves to files, and worms, which can spread on their own. And then there are Trojans, which typically rely on you to install them. For example, there was this malware called Skulls that replaced all the icons on Symbian phones with skull images.
Oh, I remember that. That was a while back.
Right. And there was Com Warrior, which was a worm that spread through MMS messages and Bluetooth.
Wow. So it's not just about downloading things anymore. It can spread through other means, too.
Exactly. And we're seeing all sorts of new variants all the time. There's malware that can sign you up for premium subscriptions without your knowledge. There's even malware that hides inside of games.
Okay, so malware is a big one. It comes in all shapes and sizes. What's the next category of threats we should be aware of?
Well, after malware, phishing is a major one. This is all about tricking you into handing over your sensitive information.
So it's like social engineering.
Exactly. And we see a lot of this through SMS messages, which is called smishing.
Smishing. Okay, I've heard of that.
So they might pretend to be your bank or a delivery company. And often they create a sense of urgency or panic.
Like, your account's been locked or you have to act now kind of thing.
Exactly. And they'll often include a link for you to click on, which of course is malicious.
So what makes smishing so effective?
Well, people tend to trust SMS messages more than they trust emails. They see it as a more direct and personal form of communication.
That makes sense. But what about email phishing? Is that still a thing?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Email phishing is still very much alive and well. And it's particularly problematic on phones because it's harder to see the full details of the sender. On a computer, you can hover over a link and see where it's really going.
Right.
But on a phone, you don't have that luxury. So it's much easier to click on a malicious link without realizing it.
Okay, so what are some common examples of email phishing?
Well, fake PayPal emails are common. Saying your account's been deactivated or something like that. And then there were alerts about compromised credit cards, like that one from Apple a few years back.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
And then there are things like fake CEO fraud, where they pretend to be your boss and ask you to transfer money.
So the tactics are pretty much the same as they've always been. It's just the platform that's changing.
Exactly. And they're taking advantage of the limitations of mobile devices, that visual limitation,
Yeah.
the small screen.
Right. So it's even more important to be cautious and verify things independently.
Absolutely. If something seems suspicious, don't click on any links. Contact the company directly through their official channels.
Okay, so we've got smishing and email phishing. What about social media?
Oh, social media is a huge target for phishing attacks. We tend to trust the people in our networks, which makes us more vulnerable to these scams.
So like fake profiles and things like that.
Yeah, fake profiles, compromised accounts, they'll spread phishing links, they'll run fake giveaways. They even use social media for job scams and investment scams.
Yeah.
Particularly with cryptocurrency these days.
Yeah, crypto scams are everywhere.
It's really unfortunate. But social media platforms provide a direct channel to a massive audience, and they often rely on algorithms that can target people based on their interests and demographics. So it's very easy for attackers to reach a large number of potential victims.
And people are more likely to let their guard down on social media because it's seen as a more informal and personal space.
Right. That's why it's so important to be aware of these scams.
Yeah.
And to be careful about who you trust online.
Okay, so we've covered the main types of phishing, smishing, email phishing, social media. Are there any other methods that we should be aware of?
Well, we're also seeing phishing through QR codes now, which is called quishing.
Quishing, that's a new one.
Yeah, it's basically just a different way of delivering a malicious link. They hide it in a QR code. And then when you scan the code with your phone, it takes you to a fake website.
So you have to be careful about what QR codes you scan.
Exactly. And then there's voice phishing or vishing. This is where they try to trick you over the phone.
Oh, like those tech support scams?
Right. They might pretend to be from Microsoft or Apple
Uh-huh.
or your bank, and they'll try to convince you to give them remote access to your computer or your phone. Or they'll try to get you to reveal your personal information.
So again, it's all about social engineering, exploiting human psychology to get you to do something you shouldn't.
Exactly.
So we've talked a lot about malware and phishing. What about the software on our phones? Can that be a security risk too?
Absolutely. Both Android and iOS can have vulnerabilities. On Android, it's particularly challenging because it's a more open platform. There's so many different manufacturers, there's so many different versions of the operating system out there.
Right. So it's harder to keep track of everything.
Exactly. And that can lead to security gaps, vulnerabilities in how the phone manages memory, for example. And then there's the whole issue of unpatched software.
So updates are really important.
Absolutely crucial. And there's a whole database of known vulnerabilities. The CISA catalog is a good example. It just highlights the sheer number of potential security flaws that are out there.
Wow. So Android users really need to stay on top of those updates.
Absolutely. But iOS isn't immune either. We've seen things like remote code execution exploits, where attackers can run code on your phone without you doing anything. And there are vulnerabilities in the apps themselves.
So even Apple devices are not completely secure.
Nothing is completely secure.
Yeah.
And What's interesting is that even physical access to an unlocked phone can be a risk. There was this exploit a while back that could bypass the remote wipe feature after someone stole a phone.
Wow, that's scary. So even if you have all the security settings enabled, someone could still get access to your data if they have physical possession of your phone.
Right. It highlights the importance of having a strong passcode or using biometrics, and of course enabling encryption and remote wipe.
Okay, so the operating system can have vulnerabilities. What about the apps themselves?
Yeah, apps can be a major security risk too. There's a whole list of common app vulnerabilities. The OWASP Mobile Top 10 is a good resource.
So things like improper credential usage, insecure authentication, insufficient input validation.
Exactly. And these vulnerabilities can provide a direct pathway for attackers to access sensitive data or to take control of your device.
So it's not just about the phone itself, it's about the apps that we use on it.
Right. Security needs to be built into the apps themselves from the ground up.
Okay, so let's move on to another potential risk. Public Wi-Fi. I think we all know that it's not the most secure thing in the world.
Right. The main risk with public Wi-Fi is what's called a man-in-the-middle attack. So imagine you're at a coffee shop and you connect to their free Wi-Fi.
I do that all the time.
Yeah, most people do. But what you might not realize is that someone else could be intercepting the communication between your phone and the website you're visiting. They're essentially eavesdropping on your conversation.
And they could see things like my passwords and credit card numbers.
Potentially. Because a lot of these public Wi-Fi networks lack encryption.
So what can we do to protect ourselves?
Well, the best thing is to use a VPN, a virtual private network. This creates a secure tunnel for your data, even on an unsecured network.
Okay, so a VPN is basically like a bodyguard for your data. That's a good way to put it. Okay. Any other tips for using public Wi-Fi safely?
Yeah, make sure you're using HTTPS websites, the ones with the little padlock icon in the address bar. And avoid accessing any sensitive information like your bank account or your email while you're on public Wi-Fi.
Makes sense. So VPN, HTTPS, avoid sensitive information. Anything else?
Yeah, disable auto-connect to Wi-Fi networks. And double-check the network name before you connect. Sometimes attackers will set up fake Wi-Fi hotspots with names that are very similar to the legitimate ones.
So it could be like Starbucks free Wi-Fi instead of Starbucks Wi-Fi.
Exactly. And if you're really concerned about security, consider using your phone's personal hotspot instead of public Wi-Fi.
Okay, so that's public Wi-Fi. What about downloading apps from unofficial sources?
Yeah, that's a big no-no.
Yeah.
When you download apps from anywhere other than the official app stores, you're significantly increasing your risk of getting malware or adware.
Why is that?
Well, the official app stores, like the Google Play Store and the Apple App Store, have security vetting processes. They check the apps for malware and other security risks before they allow them to be listed. But unofficial sources don't have those same checks in place.
So it's like buying something from a shady street vendor versus buying it from a reputable store.
Exactly. And we've seen some pretty nasty malware spread through fake apps that were downloaded from unofficial sources. Things like Gooligan, Agent Smith, RedDrop.
So stick to the official app stores. Got it. What about passwords?
Oh, passwords, the bane of our existence.
Right. We all have so many of them.
Exactly. And it's so easy to fall into bad habits, like using weak passwords or reusing the same password for multiple accounts.
I know I'm guilty of that.
We all are. But it's so important to use strong, unique passwords for every single account and to enable multi-factor authentication whenever possible.
What's multi-factor authentication again?
It's basically just adding a second layer of security. So even if someone gets your password, they can't access your account without also having that second factor.
Like a code that's sent to your phone.
Exactly.
Okay, so strong passwords, multi-factor authentication. Any other tips for managing our passwords?
Yeah, consider using a password manager. It can help you generate and store all of your passwords securely. And avoid saving your passwords in plain text, like in a note on your phone or in an email.
Right. And be careful about using public Wi-Fi when you're accessing sensitive accounts.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, but there's one more thing I wanted to touch on, and that's app permissions.
Yes. Permissions. They can be a bit of a minefield.
Yeah, I always feel like I'm just clicking allow without really thinking about it.
Yeah, we've all been there. But it's important to pay attention to the permissions that you're granting to apps. They often ask for access to your location, your contacts, your camera, your microphone, all sorts of things.
And sometimes they ask for more than they really need.
Exactly. They collect this data and use it for various purposes. for advertising, for personalization, for analytics. And while some of this data collection is legitimate, it's important to be aware of what's being collected and how it's being used.
So what can we do to protect our privacy?
Well, the first step is to simply review the permissions that you're granting, both before and after you install an app, and only grant the permissions that are absolutely necessary for the app to function.
Okay, so be selective about the permissions. Anything else?
Yeah, check the app's privacy policy. It should explain how they're collecting and using your data. And consider using privacy-focused apps.
Yeah.
There are alternatives to the big tech giants that are more respectful of your privacy.
Right. And of course, keep your operating system and your apps up to date.
Absolutely. Updates often include security patches that can fix privacy vulnerabilities.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of potential security risks: malware, phishing, vulnerabilities in the operating system and apps, public Wi-Fi, unofficial app sources, passwords, app permissions. Is there anything else we should be aware of?
Well, we should also talk about physical security. What happens if you lose your phone or if it gets stolen?
Oh, right. That's a good point.
If your phone isn't locked, whoever finds it has access to everything on it. Your photos, your messages, your contacts, your bank accounts.
It doesn't bear thinking about.
That's why it's so important to have a strong passcode or to use biometrics,
Okay.
like fingerprint scanning or facial recognition.
And to enable encryption and remote wipe.
Exactly. Encryption scrambles your data so that it's unreadable without the decryption key. And remote wipe allows you to erase all of the data on your phone remotely if it's lost or stolen.
Okay, so strong passcode, biometrics, encryption, remote wipe, anything else we can do to protect ourselves in case of theft or loss.
Yeah, be aware of your surroundings.
Yeah.
Don't leave your phone unattended in public places. And if your phone does get lost or stolen, report it to the authorities and to your mobile carrier immediately.
Right. And change your passwords for all of your important accounts.
Exactly. And it's also worth noting that there are some vulnerabilities with airplane mode. If someone steals your phone and puts it in airplane mode, you might not be able to track it or wipe it remotely.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's a good thing to be aware of.
Okay, so physical security is important. What about social engineering? We talked about that a little bit earlier in the context of phishing.
Yeah, social engineering is all about manipulating people psychologically. Using things like trust, fear, urgency, curiosity to get them to do something that they shouldn't.
So it's not just about technical tricks, it's about understanding human behavior.
Exactly. And we see social engineering used in all sorts of scams. Phishing attacks, of course, but also things like fake tech support calls, fake prize notifications, fake charity requests.
So how can we protect ourselves from social engineering?
Well, the first step is to be aware of it, to understand the tactics that these scammers use.
So education is key.
Absolutely. And then it's about being skeptical. If something sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And don't be afraid to ask questions, verify things independently. If someone calls you claiming to be from your bank, hang up and call the bank directly using the number on the back of your card.
Right. Don't just take their word for it.
Exactly. And be cautious about clicking on links or downloading attachments from unknown sources, even if it seems like it's from someone you know.
So trust but verify.
Exactly. And then finally, just be aware of the emotional triggers that these scammers use. Fear, urgency, greed. If you can recognize those triggers, you're less likely to fall for their tricks.
Okay, so education, skepticism, awareness of emotional triggers, those are the key defenses against social engineering. Okay, so we've talked about a lot of different security risks. Malware, phishing, vulnerabilities in the operating system and apps, public Wi-Fi, unofficial app sources, weak passwords, app permissions, physical security, social engineering. Is there anything else we've missed?
Well, there's one more thing that's absolutely crucial, and that's keeping your phone's software up to date.
Oh, right. Updates.
Exactly. Updates often include important security patches that fix known vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
So if you ignore these updates, you're leaving yourself exposed to potential attacks.
So it's not just about getting the latest features. It's about protecting yourself from security threats.
Exactly. And this applies to both the operating system and the apps that you use.
So how can we make sure that we're always up to date?
Well, both Android and iOS have settings that allow you to enable automatic updates. So that's the easiest way to make sure that you're always running the latest and greatest software.
Okay, so automatic updates are the way to go.
In most cases, yes. But it's also a good idea to check for updates manually every now and then, just to be safe.
Right.
And it's worth noting that older devices might eventually stop receiving updates. So if you're using an older phone, you might want to consider upgrading to a newer model that's still supported.
Okay, so update, update, update. That's the message.
Absolutely. It's one of the most important things you can do to protect yourself from security threats.
All right, so as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the key takeaway for our listeners?
Well, I think the main takeaway is that staying safe on your smartphone requires a proactive, multi-layered approach. It's not just about installing an antivirus app and calling it a day. It's about developing good security habits, staying informed about the latest threats, and being vigilant in an ever-evolving threat landscape.
Right, it's about taking responsibility for your own security.
Exactly. And it's a continuous process. Threats are constantly evolving, so we need to be constantly learning and adapting.
Well, on that note, I have one final thought for our listeners. As our lives become increasingly intertwined with these devices, we're carrying around our entire lives in our pockets these days. What unforeseen security challenges might emerge in the future? And how can we prepare for those unknown risks?
That's a great question. And I think it's something we all need to be talking about. As technology advances, new vulnerabilities will inevitably emerge. So we need to cultivate a mindset of continuous learning and adaptation.
Yeah.
To stay ahead of the curve and to be prepared for whatever new threats come our way.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for listening, everyone, and stay safe out there.
Thanks for having me.